My name is Mark van Eyck. I'm joined by Ricardo Mendes, and we're here today to talk about the ARM templates and the community around that. So we have three key takeaways for you. The first takeaway is we have three takeaways. The first one is, why should I learn the language? And I'll explain what I mean with language in just a bit. What's the value of not an ARM template, but specifically your ARM template? Just a show of hands, who has ever created an ARM template before? Well, that's pretty good, like half. And we'll look at what can you do today by leveraging the community of ARM templates, because you don't necessarily need to start from scratch. There's a lot of stuff out there already. I want to start by telling a story. When I was young, we would go to France on holiday. Who's been to France before? Wow. What language do they speak? It's not English. So they speak French. And I don't know about you, but my French isn't too good. At least it wasn't when I started there. So each year we would go there, and my French would improve. And essentially, I think that by the last time I get there, I was able to get my way around. Now, when I was 20-something, we went to Italy. Who's been to Italy? Well, that's less. They have a nasty habit, too. They speak Italian. And that's even worse than French. I don't want to offend anyone that's Italian by nature, but I wasn't able to speak a word of Italian. So we decided to go to the non-touristic route to show the real Italia. And one morning I woke up and said, well, I want some bread. And you've probably all been in this situation, like you go to this local bakery and, well, how do you get what you want? Like you point, right? You point to the stuff that you want and you raise your fingers for the amount. And then they have this cash check. It doesn't have any numbers on it. So they say the price in Italian, you don't have a clue what it is. So you just hand over your wallet, like pick whatever you want. And you walk out feeling like you just got robbed, but at least you have some bread. Now, I was brave enough, or dumb enough, we might debate that, to go to a barber shop in that same vacation. So I came into the barber shop. There was this old guy standing there. And in the best Italian that I can think of, I explained something like, dos millimetros. It sounded Italian to me. I don't have a clue if it was. And the guy just looked at me all glazy. He didn't have a clue what I meant. So he turned around, picked something from the table, turned back, and in one hand he had a hair clipper. In the other hand, the scissor. Now, I was faced with this decision, like, what am I going to do? Where am I going to point at? So I figured, well, the hair clipper is going to probably result me in walking out bald. So I'll go for the safer choice and go for the scissors. With the result that I walked out looking like a plucked chicken. So these guys that I was on vacation with, they had a laugh. I didn't. But essentially, that's the key reason why we're here today. Because French is like PowerShell. Who knows to write a script in PowerShell? That's about everybody. Italian, that's JSON. And JSON is a new language that you have to learn. Now, learning a new language, just like Italian, that's hard, right? I mean, they don't have a clue what you're saying. But what you don't want to have is your application that you run in production looking like a plucked chicken. So what I'm trying to do here today is to explain a bit of Italian. Just the basics to get you started. And then from there, you will have to take it to the next level. Now, why is JSON and ARM templates, why is that so important? Who has seen this image before? a couple of you. So essentially, Azure Stack combined with Azure will cover, well, the whole world, as you can see here, with environments. Now, who and what will make your environment any different than your neighbors? I mean, they're going to roll in a rack. It has Azure Stack installed. It's going to be the same thing as your neighbor. So what differentiates you from your neighbor? That's the stuff that you put on top of it. And that's what the ARM templates do. So if you look at the work that you're going to do with Azure Stack, or with Azure for that matter, it's the ARM templates. That's why it's so super important. So what I'll try to do is, just like that barber who had a hair clipper and a scissor, we're going to look at some tools that you can use to work with ARM templates. Just start very simple. Let's flip the screen here. This is what kind of tool? Notepad. Everybody knows Notepad. This is an ARM template, the most basic ARM template that you can get. You can just read it in Notepad. You not necessarily want to edit it in Notepad, but you can if you want to. Now, what I'm going to do is probably going to scare you off. I'm going to open a tool called Visual Studio. And you might think, well, wait a minute, I'm at Ignite, I'm not at Build. This is not a dev conference, this is an IT Pro conference. Why are you going to show Visual Studio? Well, Visual Studio has UI elements built for you to improve that experience on creating templates. So let's open Visual Studio. And there's a couple of things that I want to highlight. First of all, you can see this, the Community 2015 edition. Now, if you want to try this at home, you can download this for free. That's a different thing if you work for an enterprise. There's licensing limitations here. But Visual Studio Community Edition, if you want to try and create ARM templates at home, that's free. So you can just use that. So forget about the whole UI. Just bear with me and look at the stuff that I click on. So I'm going to create a new project. And what I will get is the ability to create an Azure resource group. So I'll select that. We'll call it Ignite. And I click OK. Now what opens is a UI, and that's a UI that was added. I don't know, I think that the UI is already available as part of the recent SDK. If it's not, it's going to be available next week. But what you're seeing here is a drop-down menu, which was recently added. And it allows you to either pick of a small list of built-in templates. These are pre-staged templates. But I can also connect to repositories on GitHub. Now, we'll get to GitHub later. I just want to show you that there's a large amount of templates that you can already use, both for Azure and Azure Stack. So if I look, for instance, at the Azure Quick Start templates, it's loading and it's found 418 templates that you can use. So there's a lot of stuff out there. Let's just start with a blank template. Essentially, I'm doing the same as the stuff that I just showed you in Notepad. So this will open up a project. On the right-hand menu, you can see that there's an Azure deploy.json. That's the default naming convention for an Azure ARM template. So let's open that one. And it should render exactly the same as the Notepad file I just had open. But what you can see, I have different colors. Instead of Notepad being one color, I now have different colors for the code. That is because I have IntelliSense. IntelliSense is provided by the schema of JSON, and that allows me to not only type in code, but I can get autocomplete on the code that I type in. Now you can see a couple of root elements, and we'll describe all of them. So we'll start with the schema. The schema references the template, if you will, that describes all the valid settings that you can create within an ARM template. Then there is a content version. The content version is always specified in these 4 octets. Then there is an element which is called parameters. Just like you know with PowerShell, parameters allow you to specify values which are requested at deployment time from a tenant. Then there's something called variables, and variables are values that you can reuse throughout your template. So you specify them once, reuse them throughout your template. If you make a change to the variable, it's going to change throughout your template. Then there's something called resources. And these are the actual resources that will deploy on the platform. Now you can create and deploy an ARM template without the resource. You might say, well, why is that useful? Because I'm not deploying anything. And that has to do with the outputs. The outputs renders values and gives that back to you at deployment time. So if you're familiar with PowerShell and you have a variable and you want to look at what's in the variable, this is kind of what you can use the outputs for. So if you just deploy an empty template with no resources in it, and you use the output settings, that allows you to look at the variables you just did in a very fast way because it's not creating any resources. So what I want to do with you is just start from scratch, add a resource, and based on all the changes that I make, I'll explain some of the best practices. So let's just start by adding a resource. Now what you can see is that the resource setting is closed with 2 square brackets, meaning it's an array. So we can add additional resources in there in that same resources section. I'll just use a single resource, and we'll do that by opening 2 curly brackets. And each resource that you add have the same root elements, at least 4 of them. And why is that? Because Azure Resource Manager needs to understand to which resource provider it needs to route the request to. That's both the resource provider, that's the API version, that is the location where it needs to route it to, and the properties that you're specifying for that particular resource. So in this case, I'm going to create a storage account, just a simple storage account, and we'll start with the name. Now, when I type stuff in, you see that it automatically filters based on IntelliSense. So that's a value of Visual Studio compared to, for instance, Notepad. So the first thing that we have to specify is a name. Now, I can create a name, for instance, storage account. Would that deploy? Well, it probably would deploy, but it would fail on the fact that the name storage account might not be unique, because the storage account has to have a unique name because you get a public endpoint for it. Now, if I were to type in that static value and add some kind of capital to it, it would fail as well, because a storage account requires all lowercase characters. Now, what you can do within an ARM template is use something called template functions. So instead of specifying all static text, you can replace that with a calculation, if you will. We do that with 2 square brackets. This instructs Azure Resource Manager that within those 2 square brackets, there's a template function. And the template function that we can create, we can either do that on the name specifically, or, and that's what we're going to do here, we're going to create a variable for that. So I'll call the variable storage account name. Now, there's maybe one additional thing that you'll notice right now is that I'm typing in 3 words concatenated to each other, so without spaces, but the first word is lowercase, and the additional words are starting with a capital. This is the default naming convention that we use throughout the whole template. And you'll see that even the IntelliSense that's provided uses that same naming convention. So that's best practice number 1. Now, we'll create that function, 2 square brackets, and there's a lot of template functions that you can use. I'm not going to cover all of them. There's actually documentation on azure.com which goes through all the template functions that exist. I'm going to use 2 here. That's concatenate, meaning that I'll append 2 words to each other, and that is unique string, because we just specified that a storage account needs something unique to be globally available and globally unique. And there's one interesting thing to know here is that when you create a storage account on Azure, it will look at the end of the name of the storage account. If you have multiple storage accounts that end with the same string, it will disperse it across different racks. So what we'll do is we'll use a unique string and append that with a fixed value. And we'll call that storage. That doesn't matter anymore. So first of all, we'll start with a concat. And a concatenation is appending two values. So I could say, let's something like my storage. And the end result would be one word, which is my storage. Now, we don't want that static value. We want something unique. So what we can do is replace this part with that unique string. Now, I don't have to add two square brackets again, because Azure Resource Manager already knows that this is a template function. So I can just add another template function within that, and it will automatically translate that. So we're going to add a unique string. You can see that auto resolves. And that unique string, we need a value for that. Because a unique string is essentially a hash of a value. And that hash is always the same based on the value that we're referencing. So in this case, we can pick something like the ID of the resource group that we're deploying to. And that is calculated or created at deployment time, because we don't have the resource group yet. So we'll do something called resource group. Oh, not within strings. Resource group. And we'll take the ID of that. So what we just did, pick the ID of the resource group. We hash that into a unique string, which is automatically lowercase and compliant with the requirements for a storage account. We append the word storage to it, ensuring that we have multiple storage accounts, will always disperse across different racks. And we have a variable for that. But we do not use it yet in our resource. So how do we reference that? Same thing, we use a template function. And we reference the variables. So we'll select that. And if I now autocomplete, it should come up with that storage account name automatically. As you can see, IntelliSense even highlights where I use that value over and over. So that's the first thing we need, the name. Second thing is when we route it to a resource provider, ARM needs to know which resource provider. So we need to specify the type of resource that we're creating. Now that's a combination of a resource provider and the resource type. So let's do type within quotes. And you will see it will populate a full list of all the resource providers that are available in Azure today. So we'll type in Microsoft. We need storage. And you will automatically see there's only one type within the Microsoft.storage resource provider that is a storage account. So let's select that, comma. Now what you're seeing that each time I'm adding a comma. Because there is no additional line in this code block, it gets curly brackets. The last line within the code block doesn't have a comma. All the additional ones have. So I just specify the type. Each resource type has an API version. There are multiple API versions that exist for a single resource type. And the reason why that's there is that each time we introduce new capabilities to a resource or a resource provider or a resource type, a new API version is created. The reason why we're doing that is that if you have an API version specified in your template with properties set on it, and we introduce new capabilities, which has effect on those properties that you set, it doesn't affect this because you're hard coding the API version. So you're strong versioning your template. So the template always knows which API version to use, and that means that the functionality doesn't break. So it's crucial that the API version is specified. It's a required value. Now, because I started with specifying the resource type, now the schema knows which filters it needs to provide on the API version. So I'm only going to see the API version relevant for the storage account in this case. So we use the 2015, just for an example. And there's a fourth required property, which is called location. This is the location that you deploy the resource to. Now, this is an interesting question that I have for you guys, because if we look at IntelliSense, it will populate the list of regions or locations that are available in Azure today. Now, what happens if I specify whatever value, let's say West US, and I take this deployment template and I want to deploy it to Azure Stack? Would that succeed? No, right? Because there is probably no West US in your Azure Stack environment. Right now, it's only local even. So what would be the solution to solve that issue? Any suggestions? Sorry? Update the Azure Stack location?
No, URL of Azure Stack.
Okay. Yeah, so let's assume it's local for that region. So how would I then specify local here? Because that's kind of hard coding it to that specific region.
Use
a parameter? Okay. So let's assume I create a parameter. That's a very good point. How would I ensure that the tenant doesn't make a typo? So if I create a parameter, let's actually do just that. Let's create a parameter for that. Because that was the initial reaction I had as well. Fantastic, I just can create a parameter and ask the tenant, like, to what location do you want to deploy? And I would just append local to all those regions that are in Azure. But after TP2 for Azure Stack, we will see that local will be replaceable to your own region or to your own location. So your data center might be called Amsterdam or whatever. Now, do I hard code all the applicable values? I can't. So is it just an open string? That's risky because essentially a user might make a typo and the deployment would fail. So how do I ensure that my deployment will always succeed despite the region or environment that I'm using? We're actually going to use a template function for that as well. So what we do, square brackets, and we'll use the resource group, and the resource group has additional properties. And that property in this case is location. And that means that this resource will always be created in the same location as the resource group that you're deploying to. So whether you deploy this to Azure Stack or to Azure, doesn't matter. It will always create that resource in the same resource group. Now, is that valid for every scenario? Not really. If you have an application which spans to different regions, to different locations, you want to have traffic manager in front of that, you'll need to specify the locations. But for 99% of the deployments that I've seen in ARM templates, this will do. So that's best practice number 2. Now, there's one additional thing that we need to specify. As you can already see by IntelliSense, the properties is also in bold. Now, what's properties? Properties essentially is the resource-specific details. Because you can imagine that if I deploy a web app that has different requirements than when I deploy a storage account in this case. A storage account has a replication mechanism. A web app has a SKU. So in this case, if we look at properties, let's start typing there. And you even see that the schema provides IntelliSense on the properties of that particular resource type. So there's one required property here, which is the account type. Now, this is an interesting case to use a parameter for. Surely I can hard code it, so I can say I want local redundant storage for this account, but I want to provide that capability to the tenant to specify what kind of replication mechanism we're using here. So let's create a parameter for that. So the parameter is going to be storage account type. Notice the naming convention I'm using here. And this has additional properties. So it's not just one field that I'm specifying. I'm actually specifying two values, two properties for this parameter. One is, wait for IntelliSense, the type of parameter I'm asking the tenant to specify. And you will see that you can create array, booleans, integers, secure string. In this case, we're just going to ask for a string. And this also ensures that it renders properly in the UI. And the type or the value that we're going to add, wait for IntelliSense, is I can either say, well, I don't specify any value. That means that when I deploy, the tenant will always be asked to submit a value. But I can also say, well, let's specify a default value, which is very useful because if the tenant doesn't specify a value, this value will be used. So in this case, the default value will be standard LRS. But essentially, he can just type in anything. And he can type in a value which is not valid, causing the deployment template to fail. So the second thing that we're going to do is specify the allowed values. Now that's different for the regions we just saw, because essentially we don't know the number of, or the names of the locations that could be a region. But in this case, we know. We know the replication mechanisms which are there. They're fairly static, so we can specify them. Now you see this is an array, so you can add multiple values. So do standard LRS, standard GRS, and we'll do another one which is standard read access GRS. And there's one additional value which is not required, but at least useful to add, and that is metadata. Now, metadata allows you to specify a description for the parameter that is shown to the tenant when you're deploying. So that helps him to understand what the purpose of the parameter is. So let's do a description. And this is the storage account type. No comma needed. So what do we have is a parameter, a variable. We need to reference that parameter here. Same thing. We do that by specifying the, or referencing the parameter in this case, template function, parameter, and that auto-resolves to the parameter name. The only thing that we didn't specify yet is the outputs. So let's quickly add that one as well. So we'll call that the storage account name. That's probably the most interesting to have a look at. And this is the same concept as the parameters. So we'll take a value and a type, because we also specify the output type. So the type in this case is a string. And the value will be the same parameter or the same variables storage account name. That's it. We just created our first ARM template. Yes, sir. So very good question. I'll repeat the question. It's a lot of code that we're typing in here, specifically just to create a storage account. Is there a graphical UI that we can use with drag and drop capabilities? Let me give you one example to even emphasize your point. Because we did a lot of typing to create just a storage account. And you might say, well, Mark, that's great, but I just need 2 lines of code in PowerShell to create that same storage account. Why the heck are you doing this so difficult, right? And specifically, if you know PowerShell and you're learning that Italian stuff, it's hard. I noticed this is easy. So why would you? Well, for a specific storage account, I would go for PowerShell as well. But your application is probably not going to look like a storage account, just a storage account. Let's take an example of an application which deploys a domain controller. I'll get to your point on the UI. And the domain controller has additional tiers added to it, so member servers, which has dependencies. Because if you deploy everything at the same time, your domain controller is still in the process of being a domain controller, becoming one, when the second machine is already trying to add it to the domain. So that deployment will fail. Well, how do you solve that? You build in the logic to wait for that domain controller to be done. So you have the member serving, polling the domain controller. Are you domain controller? Are you ready? Are you ready? Yes? Okay, then I'm going to join. So it's up to you to build that application logic. Now, ARM, just like DSC, is declarative. That means you only describe the end state of your application. You describe the dependencies between these resources, and the platform will figure out the logic for you. Now, once again, that's not useful for just that storage account. But if you take that example of a multi-tier application with a dependency on the domain controller, for example, now it becomes very interesting. Now, the same feeling I had when I started working with ARM, like, why is there no UI for this? So if we go back to Visual Studio, what I can actually do, on the left menu, you see that there's a JSON outline. Now within that JSON outline, I can add resources. So if I would go to storage account, I would specify the name, my storage account, add, and we're done. But I wouldn't have much of a demo then. But there's definitely UI in Visual Studio, and it defeats me the purpose of explaining. But what you can see, it created a variable for the name. It specified resource group location for the location. So all the stuff that I just explained, Visual Studio is doing the same thing for you, right? Now, this is tooling to author a template, to create it. But how do you deploy it? Well, the easiest thing is you go to the portal. I have the Azure Stack portal open here. And I can click on New. And that will open up the menu to deploy any kind of resource type. But there's also something called a template deployment. So if I click on that icon, I can click on Add a Template. And that allows me to kind of copy paste, and you will even see it's a similar UI as we just saw in Visual Studio with the JSON outline. It has those same menu items, and I can even add a resource, just like we did in Visual Studio, but it's limited. I don't even have a storage account here. So what I can do is copy over the code that I just created, Control A, Control Z, cancel that, and paste that in. And you will notice in the JSON outline in a second, it will automatically render the resources that I created, the parameters and the variables. So if I save that, it renders the parameter I created. So if I click on parameters, there's my storage account type. The default value is standard LRS. And when I click the drop down, I should see those 3 values. Fantastic. Then I create a resource group or use an existing resource group. Now this is interesting. What if you deploy a template to an existing resource group? What happens? Let's make it even more interesting. What happens if there's a storage account in there? Well, it depends on the name of the storage account. You just saw me add an additional resource based on that UI in Visual Studio. That will create two storage accounts in the same resource group. But if it has the same name, Azure Resource Manager is idempotent. And that means I can rerun that template against different environments, but also at the same environment. If it detects that that resource with the same name is there, it will look at the properties and compare them. If they're the same, it's gonna change nothing. If there's a difference, it's gonna update that storage account based on the changes in your template. So you could look at your template as the source of truth. There's no need to go into your VM anymore and make changes. You just make the changes to your template and rerun it against your same application. And within IaaS, you have something called VM extensions, which allows you to configure stuff within the virtual machine. And you can use idempotent code for that as well, something like DSC. So that means if you deploy a SharePoint farm with ARM using VM extensions with DSC, you can just rerun that over and over again against the same environment. And it will ensure that's in the state that is in your ARM template. So if you get an audit, what does your application look like? You just hand over your ARM template. Go learn Italian.
So is that used for incremental deploy?
Sorry?
Is that mechanism used for incremental deploy?
So the question is that useful for incremental deploy? It's useful for any type of deployment. So incremental, new, or even ensuring that your application is in the state that is described within the ARM template. So that's very much true, yes. Now, another way that you can deploy a template is with PowerShell. Now it becomes confusing because we had PowerShell, which was able to create that ARM temp or that storage account by referencing commandlet, which actually creates just a storage account. But there's also commandlet which allows you to call on that ARM template and deploy it from there. So we can do that with PowerShell, but we can even do that with Azure CLI. What is Azure CLI? Well, that's a cross-platform CLI, so you can install that on your Mac, on your Linux, and on your Windows machine in this case. So let's copy over this code just to show you. I have the CLI open, and when I do an Azure Help, you will see that I will get all kinds of information related to what kind of symbol that you're familiar with within PowerShell. What details do I need to deploy that? So if I paste in the code, it's going to create a resource group, and within this resource group, it's going to deploy my ARM template that I just created. And that ARM template creates a storage account. Now the thing is, Azure CLI doesn't allow me to author a template. Visual Studio does. I just showed you can deploy with PowerShell, and within Visual Studio, there is a deployment script, as you can see here, that I can reference by just clicking on the project, right-clicking on it, and say deploy, do a new deployment. And what's really cool within Visual Studio, based on the access that I have with this Azure AD account, I can even choose to what environment I want to deploy to, which is either Azure or Azure Stack. It's the same template. It's the same code. It's the same Azure Resource Manager. So that's why Azure Stack is so important and so unique, is that I only have to create my application template once, and I can deploy both to Azure and Azure Stack from the same UI. So in this case, I'm going to use Azure Stack. I can either create a new resource group or use an existing one. And for the people that watch closely, and I know it's Friday morning, so I'll help. that resource group was just created by the deployment I did through Azure CLI. So no matter what tool I use, I'm talking to the same Azure Resource Manager. Whether that's the portal, whether that's Visual Studio, an open community tool, whether that's CLI or Visual Studio, I'm seeing the same thing. I'm obeying to the same RBAC rules. I'm using the same template orchestration engine. So I'm going to create a new resource group. Ignite, we'll call deploy VS. And we're going to deploy that to local. That's the only reason that I have there. Create. And if I click on Edit Parameters, it's the same thing. Save that. Now, with the new update that we added in Visual Studio, that will be either available already or soon, I'm not sure, there's this check mark which says validation only. So it will not deploy the resource group. It will only ensure that your template is valid, and it will test it against that environment that you are testing it to. I'm actually going to deploy it. And the reason why I'm deploying it is showing you this output window. Now, this output window is the output of the PowerShell script that's run. And it will give you all the details of the steps that are going through within that deployment. Now, what's interesting to see is that if you look at the output that I created, that's going to show here as well. So, and what's even more interesting is that what if I made a typo? If I made a typo and I would deploy this template, it will fail. How would you solve that? Where would you go? And if you look closely, it's creating, we'll get back to this. So I can go back to the portal, go to resource groups, and find my deploy VS. It has a setting, and it says last deployment state is deploying. That's actually the deployment I just started from Visual Studio. So if I click on that, should be fast enough. It's already done. This is the location where you would be able to troubleshoot your deployment from the portal. But that means that I need to hop over to another tool to troubleshoot my deployment. If I go back to Visual Studio, that same output is rendered in the output window. So come to think of it, I can alter templates in Visual Studio, I can deploy them from Visual Studio, and I can even troubleshoot them from Visual Studio, just from a single UI. I know it's a development tool. I'm just trying to help you. I installed and deinstalled Visual Studio on my machine probably 10 times because I got kind of scared of it, like I don't know where to look and it's too much. But it's been my friend for the last year and I haven't deinstalled it yet. So I'll try to encourage you to at least try it once. It will definitely help you when you start to work on ARM templates. Now you see the output string here. That's a unique value appended with that hard-coded storage string that we added to it. Okay. How was that for a first lesson of Italian? Was it hard? It was doable, right? I mean, it's a bad day, bad timing, I know. But I didn't make it too complex, I hope. So, just to recap what we did. We created a template. We looked at Notepad. We didn't look at VS Code. That's a free tool. But it's more, well, what the name says, code. So hence the reason why I chose Visual Studio. But do know that VS Code also is installable on Mac and on Linux. So if you're doing something cross-platform, you have the Azure CLI as well as VS Code to do all the stuff that I just did. We deployed it through the portal. We went through PowerShell. We looked at the Azure CLI. And eventually, we deployed through Visual Studio. And we also looked at troubleshooting. And the only tool that you see here referenced on each of these 3 steps is Visual Studio. Now, we talked about Azure. We talked about Azure Stack. We saw the drop-down that I was able to use. I had a conversation with this gentleman in the front here earlier this morning. You can reuse that template against those different environment. But there are a couple of things that you need to be aware of to ensure that is actually the case. Because if I were to create an ARM template which would reference CDN, there's no CDN in Azure Stack. So that deployment would fail. It depends on the availability of the resource providers. So as long as the resource providers are both present in Azure and in Azure Stack, you will be able to reuse the same template. But that's also true for the APIs. If Azure introduces a new API for storage account, in this example, today, it's not going to be available in Azure Stack today. That means that if you create an ARM template referencing that new API version, it will fail on Azure Stack. So you need to be aware of the available API versions for the resource types in that Azure Stack environment. Yes, sir?
So if you built a template for public Azure, and if you wanted to deploy on Azure Stack, does that validate function checkbox now validate to make sure that the resources that you are using in Azure Public are available in Azure Stack?
Good question. I'll repeat for the recording. So this gentleman asked, if you use that template validation function in Visual Studio, which is a PowerShell capability as well, by the way, will it validate whether those resource providers and API versions are available in that particular environment that you're targeting? Yes, it will. So if the resource provider is not there, if the API version is not valid, it will fail that test, or the test will be successful, but the output would be failed. Correct. Then, and this is the biggest challenge that we're facing right now, we looked at location. We know how to fix that. But there's another value that you need to be aware of, and that's that public endpoint of the storage account. Because if you create a virtual machine, you need to specify that public endpoint to create the virtual hard disk of your operating system. And all the templates that are available today, the majority, have a hard-coded dependency, which is just a hard-coded string value in the template, which points to blob.core.windows.net, which is fine for Azure, that will deploy, but which is problematic for your Azure Stack environment because you have a different endpoint. Now, there are ways that we can solve that, and that's what we'll look at right now. So with location, we discussed that. How can you fix that? And this is a way that you can make your endpoints dynamic. And we use that by referencing a template function, which is called reference. And with reference, we can call the API during deployment and essentially ask, okay, the properties of the storage account. What is the public endpoint? And then I use that as a value to create my virtual hard disk for my VM. So we're fixing a lot of templates because when we started with Azure and creating Azure Resource Manager templates, there was no Azure Stack. There were only the regions that were available for Azure. Hence, you will see in a second there are 2 locations where you can get templates right now. This week we released a white paper. Now, this white paper does exactly the same thing you just saw me do in this demo. It will use that same storage account. It will look at all the tools that you can use. And it will also go through creating, deploying, and troubleshooting. We'll look at how do you use cross-platform capabilities, and it will use at more advanced scenarios. So what you can do is just download this white paper, do the same stuff at home that I just did. I just mentioned that there are multiple locations to get existing templates. You just saw me drill down a list of 418 templates. These templates are stored on GitHub. So let's just pull that up. 7. And there are 2 locations where you can find these repositories. So that is the Azure Quick Start Templates repository. That's all you need to remember, Azure Quick Start Templates. If you're familiar with GitHub, great. You don't need this explanation. If not, we'll dive into some terminology in a second. But this repository is publicly available. And as you can see, well, I'm just scrolling through. I'm at 1/3 right now, a lot of templates. Sir? Yeah, so this is actually folders. So the question is, this is one flat list of templates. Is there a way to search within this repository? These are actually folders that we're looking at right now, and each folder, I can open one, is for a particular scenario. And you can see that within that folder are the related templates for that particular scenario. That could contain scripts, images, and the templates themselves. I just opened up Visual Studio, so that's probably the best way to search for it. So I'll show you again. When I click File, New, Project, and I click the Azure Resource Group, it populates that list. So in this case, the Azure Quick Start repo, and it has a search function. So if I use skill set, for instance, or OMS, it will show all the templates related to OMS. So there's definitely a search capability. Let's go back to the UI here. There's a second repository, which is specifically for Azure Stack. Now, this might sound confusing because you just explained that it's the same thing. It's the same template that I can reuse over and over again against each environment. So why are there two repositories? Well, like I just explained, Azure Stack was introduced way after these templates were created. So what we're doing is updating these 400 and something templates, which is not a nice job to do. It's time consuming. And we don't want to force you with that same experience. So what we did as an intermediate, provide you with Azure Stack capable templates, which you can use to deploy on Azure Stack today. But eventually, those two repositories will merge into one. So if you want to do any contribution, whether that's for Azure Stack or Azure, use the Azure Quick Start template repository. Just use the Azure Stack as a reference. Okay. I just opened GitHub. I see a lot of confusion. My learning curve was very steep. At least that's the way I experienced with GitHub. It's complicated. Git essentially is a versioning control system. It compares text files and the differences between that. So what I'm going to show is something called GitHub Desktop, because essentially Git is command line, and it's only locally. So just to emphasize that point, GitHub is something, it's a web-hosted service that's for free, so you can just create an account, don't have to pay for it, and you can create a repository there. So that's terminology number one, a repository, something like a folder structure, if you will, as we just looked at. Now, let's just pick a GitHub account. For instance, the Azure Quick Start repo. You're not the owner of that, so you're not able to push any data into that automatically. So how does that work? Well, the first terminology that we need to look at is clone. I can clone the complete repository to my local machine. It's just a copy of the files. So I would end up with a folder locally containing all those folders we just looked at, and I can edit that. Which is great, but I don't have any access to that repository. So what you can do is create something called a pull request. That's a request to the owner of the repository to pull in your changes. The author or the owner can then evaluate your changes, and based on his evaluation, he can either decide to merge that into his code or to decline it, or ask you to make additional changes. This works, but the problem is if my machine crashes, all my changes are gone. It's just a local copy. So the capability that GitHub provides you is that you can also create your own account, and within that account you can create something called a fork. Now a fork is a moment in time copy of that repository. So you see that the arrow disappears. Changes being made right now to the root repository are not being copied over to your fork. So you need to be aware of that. What I can do now is clone that same fork locally. And the advantage over the fork is I'm the owner of that. So I can just push data back into it without doing pull requests and waiting for approval or whatever. So I now have a backup copy sitting in the cloud somewhere. And I can just push my changes to it, and I'm based on that, do a pull request from my fork to the original repository. This is the basic principle of Git and GitHub. You need at least to be aware of the terminology when you start working with this stuff, because it's complicated otherwise. Now, there's one more term that I'd like to address, and that's called a branch. Now, a branch is a index momentum of your local clone. So that means I can create additional branches, and I can switch between these branches. So essentially, if I create a branch, add a text file to it, or make changes to an existing file, and I switch to a different branch, that text file and those changes are gone. If I switch back to the original branch, those files are there again. You actually see that happening in your folder structure. So if you create a branch, add a text file, switch to a different branch, the text file is gone. If I switch back, the text file is there again. That's the purpose of branches. So it allows you to edit multiple versions of your folder structure, if you will. So that means that you can edit multiple projects and switch between them without being complete. And the reason why that branch is so important, you can push that as well to your repository, and that means that you can create a branch for a particular project that you're working on, and based on that, you then do a pull request to the original repository. And this is not even Italian, this is a completely different language. Are we on time? 60 minutes. Ricardo, you have 10 minutes for your demo?
Yeah, you can extend. Remember, most of the things I will show my session.
Good.
Keep going.
I'm going to do a 5-minute demo now, and then Ricardo can do.
Impossible. 5 minutes.
So what I'll do is I'll actually open up, I have it here on the desktop, GitHub Desktop. And GitHub Desktop is the same as the Git command line, but it has a UI. So let's have a look at that. Thought I clicked it. Oh, it's loading. There it is. Now, it's empty.
You're not on the screen.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. I just open up GitHub Desktop, and as you can see, it's empty. So how do I add or create that clone locally? So I go to the Azure Stack, in this case, for example, Quick Start Templates, and you see a button which says Clone or Download. So if I open it up, it even says Open in Desktop. So let's do that. Now this is all non-authenticated data, so I can pull it out easily. Right? Pushing it back is a different thing. It asks me, where do you want to store that folder structure? It's on my local machine. That's fine. Let's see if I can get that full screen.
Visual Studio has a plugin for GitHub, right? Why don't you use that versus GitHub?
Yep. So the question is, Visual Studio has a plugin for GitHub. Why don't you use that? There are many ways that we can interact with GitHub. That's a very good point. Usually I do that, but just to don't overcomplicate things right now, I'm using GitHub Desktop, but it's a good point. So I'm going to go to the Changes tab. There are a couple of things that I want to highlight. First of all, you see that it says no changes. I just downloaded that thing. And if I go to my folder structure, it was in GitHub. It just created that folder. And if I open that, look, there's all the folders, and I can open a single folder, and it has the files. It's just a copy of what's in GitHub right now, and I can make changes. Now, the first advice that I will give you is before you start making any changes, create a branch. Because if you screw up, you delete the branch, you're good to go. If you do that in the root repository, which is called the master, that's the primary branch that's always there, well, you need to delete the whole thing. Or you must be knowing what you're doing. So how do I create a branch? Well, next to something that is master here, I can click on this icon, and it says create new branch. So we'll call that ignite demo, create new branch. Nothing happened. It just created a branch, and now it switched to that branch as well. So let me just show you what these branches actually do. So, well, let's stick in this folder, that's fine. So that's 101, simple Windows VM. Let's add a new file to this. New text document, and I'll try to keep both open so you see what happens. If I now switch back to my master branch, and please watch the text file I just added, oh, I didn't commit yet. Let's explain that first. Any change that I make doesn't do anything yet until I commit it. Update the index of this branch with the changes I just made. So if you see someone specifying anything on related to Git, you always hear that word commit. There's funny picture going on that when there's a fire, commit first and leave the building. Because if you don't commit, your code is gone. It's just not in the index, so it's a waste of time. So commit often. Now you see that when I added that text document, it showed up in the UI right here. Let's see if I can get this full screen. I can't. Let's see if this works. Test. Yep. Now I committed it. I gave the commitment a reference. And if I would now do the same thing and switch back to master, you will see that the text file is gone. It's not part of that branch. I'm now in the original branch without that text file being there. And if I would switch back to Ignite demo, my text file is there again. So hopefully this helps to understand what these branches do. So I can create additional branches. You can create a whole tree if I wanted to. It's just like snapshots on a Hyper-V machine, right? A point-in-time momentum. And this now allows me to create a pull request and send that data as a request to the repository. Now, I created a fork. Or no, I did not. I did not create a fork. I actually pulled the data down directly. Now, I don't have push, well, I do have push access to this repo, but normally you won't have push access to this repo, so you won't be able to get the data back in unless you do a pull request. It would be more sensible to create a fork first, because then you can just make the changes on your own copy, and when you're feeling confident, well, now this actually works, and I have it in my own repository, you can ask that pull request. So how do you create that fork? Well, you already see here that there's a fork button on the top. All I have to do is click it. I have to have an account first, because otherwise, where is it going to fork it? So I'm signed in with my own account that I created for free, and I can click on fork. And it will ask me, because I have access to multiple organizations, to which account do you want to fork that? If it actually loads, I will fork it to my own repository. Luckily, this is not a Microsoft product, so I don't care that this demo fails. Let's try that again. Wow. What's going so well? It was a bad idea to do this get out demo. Essentially, it should show up and will copy over, instead of making it locally, it will copy it over to my own GitHub account.
You know, Mark,
yes?
I thought that your session was going so well, so I'm attacking your box, so this way you have a favor, so because the session was so good.
We have 9 minutes to go, so I'm going to give the session over to Ricardo. Just to recap quickly, we looked at repositories, like the folder structure you have in GitHub. The origin is the original location, so the original location of the Azure Quick Start templates in this case. The fork is something that we copied over to our own account. The clone, that's something that we took locally. And branches allows you to switch between those different things. If you want to contribute, commit your changes first to your own repository. Then you do a pull request to the origin. Now, what we didn't discuss is the CI, that's continuous integration. If you do something against the Azure Quick Start repo, your changes will trigger a deployment of the complete template. So before there's any evaluation by the author, there will be a deployment of your template to ensure that your code is solid. And after that, there will be a manual evaluation. And merge is when you did your job good, the author will merge the changes into the original code.
All right, Mark. Very good stuff. By the way, Mark mentioned the white paper, and he mentioned that we built that white paper. Actually, Mark is the author. Highly recommend you look at that white paper. Now, before I move forward, and this will be just a very quick demo, I will try to do this in 7 minutes and 8 seconds. Why doing all of this? Why GitHub? Why describing your infrastructure as code? Why, right? And especially when folks with more of an IT admin background, they ask me why. You know, why I need to deal with writing a template if I can write my bat file that just does the magic, or if I can just click through the UI. So the reason why is sometimes you have to redeploy. Sometimes you have to create multiple environments. Sometimes you have to manage not one machine, you have to manage 100 machines. And there is a limit to how many clicks you can do, right? So the idea is to show a complex template in this session. And I think one example of this is actually an Azure Quick Start template that was released 9 days ago for blockchain. Who was on Mark Rusonovich's session, Mark's and Jeffrey's session? Okay, so what I'm going to show you is the template behind that session. And of course, the deployment. All right, so if we look at the README, this is what the template deploys. At a minimum, 5 VMs, up to 25 VMs. You know, deploying 5 VMs manually, it's doable, right? Not a big deal, maybe an hour for you to click through and customize things. Now 25 VMs, who is up for the challenge? Now how about when you need to deploy on multiple environments, right? And that's actually the demo that Mark showed. Mark showed that running on Azure and Azure Stack. You are not talking about 5 VMs, you are talking about 10 VMs. All right. And lastly, you know, worse than a system that doesn't work is a system that works sometimes. Why I'm saying that? You know, when your development team develops something, it works on their environment, you put on production, it doesn't work. And then what they say, oh, it works on my machine. And then the joke is, OK, can I bring you and my machine to the customer? All right, so doing templates and defining your infrastructure reduces the change of that because your application is defined on the template. Great. So let's look at what this template looks like. So all parameterized from VM sizes to locations to number of VMs. And as we scroll down, we have things like load balancer and virtual machines. And all the way down, we have something called custom script extensions. So if we scroll all the way down to this, through this template, all right. So we see a bunch of parameters, and these parameters are going to be fed on a custom script extension that is not being shown here because it's a nested template. And that's actually the customization that happens inside the VM. So the end result of this template is when you deploy it, and I will show the end result. So let's go to Azure Stack. I have a resource group, and that resource group has all the resources deployed already. So this is the Bletchley resource group. That's the name of that project. And I have all the resources created. If I create in one of the VMs, if I click on it, and go to extensions, there is something called new user script. So this is the script that ends up inject on the VM and customizing that VM. So as I mentioned, this particular deployment involves 5 VMs. It was all built from one single template. And what happens is the resources are created, network load balances, VMs. The VMs start up. And then after the VMs start up, a custom script is injected. And inside that custom script, what happens is you can customize the VM. For this particular example, it's a Linux VM, but it works for Windows as well. So the end result of that is I have my blockchain website up and running. If we look at this address here, it's a local address, 192.168.102.11. If I go back to the portal, that's the address of the public address of one of the VMs, which is this one here. You see 192.168.112.11. That's my blockchain admin. Now, the beauty of that is this is a complex template that was also deployed in Azure. So if I go to Azure, I should be able to locate a resource group that I gave the same name, Bletchley, with the same resources. And I have a public IP as well. And that public IP points to, provides that same admin website that you saw. In Azure, I also gave a DNS name. And if we switch the screen, we have exactly the same admin interface. and now this admin interface points to public Azure. Now the details, what was on the custom script, etc., I will leave it for my session, all right? And my session is at 12:45, and what we will do is we'll build on the learnings that Mark described about templates. I won't go in creating JSON. Mark did that, but I will show you how we glue this piece together and what was the effort to put this blockchain on both Azure and Azure Stack. And also another demo that Jeffrey showed that is the Oracle demo. The bottom line is why you want to describe your infrastructure as Mark described, because very likely you have to update that, you have to deploy in many locations, and if you rely on manual steps, the chances of failure are very great. There is one question, and then we'll wrap up the session. One question over there.
Can you tell us how many man-hours or man-days it took to build that blockchain template?
The question is, can you tell how many man-hours took to build that template? Unfortunately, I don't have that information because I was not my team. Another team built that template. We can take this offline, and I can get back to you. Unfortunately, I don't have that info.
Because it's a very complex template, so I'm sure it should take several man-days.
And I will let Mark speak to that. The JSON template looks complicated, but you have to take in consideration that you can leverage existing templates to build your new ones. There is a set of community templates available, and also there are tools that allow you to build those templates the same way that Mark showed the Visual Studio. So talking about man days, that's not the unit of measure that you probably measure against a template like that.
I think I have a better way to answer that question. Is it on? It's on. Yes? Okay. So what if I were to write that same white paper in Italian? It would take me, well, months. If I were to speak Italian fluently, maybe a week. So it's not. Yes, it is connected. Give me your mic. So I'll repeat it with standing here friendly next to Ricardo.
We are not that friends, okay? Just for the record.
Don't take any photos. So if I were to create an ARM wiper, we just looked the link or looked at the link for in Italian, it would probably have taken me months if I were to get there at all, to be honest. But if I would speak Italian like fluently, it will probably take me a week. And that's the same thing for the ARM templates. Once you're able to get the hang of it, it's pretty easy to create these ARM templates. It's much more about how do I customize the specific resource and the understanding of the customization of that resource, which will take a bit more time. So in this case, it's the application logic that you need to understand, not necessarily the ARM template. You can give me any ARM template, I will be able to troubleshoot and fix that. It's just more about the application specific details, which is harder.
Great, Mark. So we are out of time. I think Mark and I will probably hang around here for a while, but we have another sessions probably coming in this room. But you feel free to speak with us as we grab this stuff here. Mark, it was a very good session. Thank you.
Thanks.
Your white paper, great stuff. Thank you for coming Friday morning. Thank you. And 141, 10:45 with Anjay, Matt, and Shri from our team. You cannot miss that. And then 12:45, yes, lunchtime. My session where I will drill down on the how we plug these things together. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of the show. Thank you.